Sergeant Mike Duke Whalen was standing guard near the customs area at John F. Kennedy International Airport, and man, let me tell you, it was a hell of a day. The sound of his heavy combat boots hitting the polished floor was about the only thing that didn't get drowned out in the constant, messy roar that New York always creates. Flight announcements in Spanish, Chinese, and, yeah, English echoed off the high ceiling before just fading away like steam in the cold air. It was a damn human anthill. The steady drone of suitcase wheels was like a nonstop rain, and an endless stream of people were rushing just to make their connecting flights. And then I saw her. Right there in the middle of all that chaos, a woman was standing who seemed to be moving at a different speed entirely, like someone hit the slow-motion button on her while she was in the middle of a busy Manhattan street. This was Evelyn Eve Mercer. She was rocking this incredibly elegant, cream-colored vintage suit from the 1940s, which looked like it had silver thread woven into it, and her long, straight, dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple, but obviously expensive style. The air around her was just different, you know? It was like a secluded park suddenly popped up right in Times Square. She was a magnet for eyes, like a light in the dark. Some folks were staring with pure curiosity, like she was some exotic animal in a zoo, while others gave her the full side eye, as if she was an alien object. My eyes, or, to be more precise, the eyes of Sergeant Mike Duke Whalen, were filled with a professional, yet antsy kind of suspicion. I elbowed my partner, Randy Cross, and pointed my chin toward Eve. Hey, Randy, look at that one. Just another rich tourist trying to look like some old-school Hollywood star. Who the hell knows what she's hiding under all those layers of fancy fabric, I muttered quietly, a crooked smile twitching on my lips. My head was already filling up with that unspoken bias you get against people whose culture seems too weird for an American airport. Eve felt that condescending stare. I know she did. But her face didn't even flinch. In fact, I thought I saw a faint smile play on her beautiful face. And it wasn't a smile of forgiveness or indifference. Nah, it was more like how an old lake accepts both a sunny day and a storm, just calmly accepting things as they are. She was quietly anticipating her cultural mission here in the United States. She was proud of her role, to bring and share the finer points of American high art with the people of this country. The feel of the vintage fabric against her skin calmed her. She took a breath, and the air, which smelled faintly of that sharp disinfectant typical of airports, only added to her feeling of newness. Eve started walking, and her every step was deliberate, like she was on a carpeted runway and not the airport floor. There was no rush in her movements. That refined grace showed she was no mere traveler. It was a beauty that can only be achieved by years of strict discipline. But, of course, nobody here understood that. People just saw her as a woman in odd clothes. She was thinking about the American translator and the officials from the Federal Agency for the Arts who were supposed to meet her. As soon as I see them, I'll be free from these strange looks, she thought, and that made her feel a bit lighter. But she didn't know that the gears of fate had already started turning in the wrong direction. Duke's twisted sense of duty interpreted her silence and calmness as proof that she was hiding something. His gaze was no longer just curiosity. It became cold and relentless, like a hunter who had finally tracked his prey. A dark shadow of misunderstanding and prejudice was hanging over her quiet journey. The line for passport control was inching forward, slowly, like a long, boring snake. The fluorescent lights cast a cold, white glare on the polished floor. Eve's elegant look stood out in that monotonous landscape. People were keeping their distance from her, as if looking at a forbidden artwork from afar. A family with small kids stared with innocent wonder, and a little one pulled on his mom's sleeve, quietly asking, "Mom, where did that queen come from?" That innocent voice quickly dissolved into the airport din. Meanwhile, busy businessmen just shot her a quick, dismissive glance before immediately looking back at their smartphones. To them, her presence was just a tiny blip in their daily grind. But one gaze was sharp and almost hostile. That was Sergeant Mike Duke Whalen. He stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the wall, coldly observing the whole scene. In his eyes, Eve looked like an unnatural threat. Why is she wearing such uncomfortable clothes? Why is she so composed when everyone is looking at her? Her absolute composure only irritated Duke. Look at her, Randy. She hasn't even blinked. That's not normal. She's definitely hiding something, he whispered to his partner again. His voice was filled with a smug confidence in his own prejudice. Eve felt that look pierce her. Even without words, she felt the temperature of the emotions directed at her: curiosity, indifference, and outright hostility. She was taking all of it in. But her mind was calm, like still water. In an old-school American drawing room, guests would remove their hats and forget their rank, focusing only on the hospitality. She felt the same way. This was a foreign country with different values. So, she would accept it. She focused on the silence inside herself. The only sound she heard was her own, steady breathing. Suddenly, a woman who walked past left behind a strong, sickeningly sweet smell of perfume. Eve frowned just slightly. It was a sharp scent, totally unlike the gentle aromas she was used to. I suppose that's another cultural difference too, she thought, letting out a quiet breath. The line moved forward again. A loud, hard tap of someone's leather shoes on the floor echoed loudly in the quiet. She could hear the faint, heavy thud of the officer stamping passports. One by one, people passed through the gates. Eve's turn was getting close. She simply calmly waited for whatever the officer would say to her. There was no anxiety or expectation on her face. Only a deep resolve to accept everything that was about to happen. Next. That faceless voice blared over the loudspeaker, and Evelyn Eve Mercer calmly stepped forward. The customs booth looked like a tiny glass fish tank. She walked up to the officer and carefully presented her American passport. But the officer didn't take it. Instead, Sergeant Mike Duke Whalen, the same guard who'd been standing by, shoved the customs agent aside and snatched the passport from her hand. It was such a crude move that people in line started giving us confused looks. Name, Mercer? Purpose of visit, tourism. Duke ground the words out, disrespectfully comparing the passport photo to her face. His voice was low, menacing, and full of suspicion. Eve didn't answer. She just calmly looked him straight in the eye. Her silence wasn't defiance. It was a pause, time to deeply understand his words and the intentions behind them. She figured it wasn't worth opening her mouth until the translator arrived, even though, truth be told, she knew English perfectly, but she was playing her part. Duke's patience snapped. He quickly and loudly flipped through the pages of her passport. Then he drummed his finger on the counter and insisted. I'm asking you, what is this outfit? It doesn't look like clothes for a work trip, does it? There was zero respect for the culture she valued in his words. It was just a cold, cutting intent to reject something foreign. Eve slowly placed both hands on the counter. The cold, plastic feel reached her fingertips. She barely tilted her head and quietly said, in perfect English, I am waiting for my translator. Her demeanor was impeccably polite and reserved. But that very politeness only added fuel to the fire in Duke's twisted mind. She's pretending not to understand to buy time, he instantly decided. Don't you dare. You know English. Duke's voice became even lower and more threatening. What are you hiding in that old-fashioned suit? Answer me. In his head, Eve was already a suspect, a legal immigrant. His self-proclaimed sense of justice was slowly but surely dismantling the dignity of the calm woman before him. The atmosphere around them clearly shifted. Curiosity turned into anxiety and even fear. Everyone held their breath, watching the absurd scene. Eve had no words to defuse the situation. And even if she did, she probably wouldn't have used them. When a storm rages, she simply bows her head and quietly waits for it to pass. That was her way of life. But this storm was going to be much longer and much fiercer than she expected. Duke's gaze lost all logic. He was focused only on cornering his victim. Her calm behavior was like water hitting hot oil, causing his anger to flare up. To him, her silence was the same as a confession of guilt. He thought of all the criminals he dealt with. They clammed up too when they were cornered. This woman is the same, Duke felt, as his suspicion turned into certainty. He shot a sharp look at the other customs officers nearby. "Look, she's suspicious," was the clear message in his eyes. At first, his colleagues looked doubtfully at the absurdity of the situation. But, seeing their sergeant's unwavering attitude, they began to lean toward his opinion. One nodded, then another. Groupthink was slowly closing in on Eve. The air around her was no longer just cold, it became sticky with malicious hostility. The cold light of the fluorescent lamps ghastly illuminated the guards' faces. Personal emotions vanished from their expressions, leaving only rules and suspicion. Eve was completely isolated. The translator, her only hope, still hadn't appeared. The meeting time was long past. Traffic? Or something worse? A momentary wave of anxiety flashed through her, and she felt her mouth go dry from the tension. But she immediately crushed that fear. Don't lose your composure. Stay calm no matter what. This was a rule she'd inherited, and a way of life for her. She slowly breathed in, returning her mind to a quiet lake. No one will steal my inner peace, our resolute will kept her back straight. A broken crackle came intermittently from the radio clipped to Duke's collar. That lifeless sound only intensified the tension. Her unwavering composure was now starting to unnerve him. Enough wasting time, Duke said with contempt. Verbal interrogation was pointless. He decided to uncover her secret in a more direct way. His prejudice had become an unstoppable current, ready to wash away her dignity. There's an old saying, silence is golden. It means being quiet and not speaking too much is sometimes more valuable than words. Eve had practiced this virtue all her life. But here, that value didn't apply. In fact, her virtue became the main reason she was branded a criminal. The deep gulf between cultures had already led to an irreversible situation. That's it. Let's go, Duke said, not waiting for Eve's reply. His words were no longer a question, but a cold order. He told a colleague he'd conduct a detailed strip search in a separate room. Hearing this, a few travelers hastily looked away and returned to their lines. An unwillingness to get involved in this mess hung in the air. Eve quietly nodded. Evelyn Eve Mercer understood perfectly well that resisting in this situation would be foolish. If you fight against a bureaucratic idiot like Duke, things only get worse. She chose patience, to wait out this humiliating moment. That was her only and greatest form of resistance. But Sergeant Mike Duke Whalen's anger was far greater than she could have imagined. He didn't lead her to that small, private room with walls. On the contrary, Duke deliberately pulled her right toward the center of the security checkpoint, the most visible part of the main arrivals hall at O'Hare International Airport, Illinois. There were no glass walls or corners here. It was an open space where hundreds of people could see from every angle. Hold on, Duke, are you really going to do this here? Asked one of his colleagues, Randy Cross, with a clear note of doubt in his voice. But Duke ignored him. His mind was filled with a grim satisfaction to completely crush the dignity of this foreign woman in public. This wasn't an investigation. It was a public lesson. His twisted sense of justice demanded it. He tightly squeezed her thin forearm. The force of his fingers mercilessly dug into her skin through the thin fabric of her vintage suit. From the pain and pressure, Eve held her breath for 1 second. But there was no hint of distress on her face. Her gaze was calmly focused on the tile pattern on the floor, a simple black and white pattern. Its regularity seemed to be the only order in this chaos. The noise around them grew. People who had been watching from afar slowly gathered, widening the circle. Thousands of stares, filled with curiosity, judgment, and a desire for scandal, pierced Eve like sharp arrows. She stood there like a criminal on an open stage. In the center of this attention, Duke smugly opened his mouth. His voice was loud and clear enough for everyone in the hall to hear. All right, let's start. I want you to take that outfit off. Right here. His words were cold as ice and completely froze the air. It was a merciless demand concerning her culture, her pride, her very humanity. Duke's brutal order was like a huge stone thrown into the hum of the airport. Silence spread like a wave. Travelers stopped. Those watching from afar held their breath. Thousands of gazes merged into one entity, focused on Eve, curiosity, shock, and a faint fear. A normal person would have found it difficult to stand under such pressure. But Eve did not falter. She quietly and slowly nodded her head once. Then she took a deep, long breath. Her breath was steady. She closed her eyes. In those few seconds of darkness, she remembered her father's face. True American dignity is to never lose yourself, regardless of the circumstances. That rule quietly echoed in her mind. Good. This is a test for me. I will quietly accept this humiliation, this disrespect. But I will not surrender my soul to them. Eve carefully opened her eyes. They shone with a clear, steel-like light, different from her previous calm. It was determination. She slowly reached for the waist of her suit. The movement of her fingers was smooth as water, without any hesitation. It was a sacred gesture, like preparing to dress, which she had repeated tens of thousands of times. The practice rooted over years was her last fortress supporting her mind. Shh. In the hushed airport lobby, only the sound of silk rubbing was clearly audible in a strange way, an elegant sound, out of place in this setting. People listened to it. Everyone held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Even a slight look of confusion crossed Duke's face. He had expected tears or hysterical resistance. But what was happening before him was completely beyond his understanding. Eve's fingers flawlessly untied the complex knot. It wasn't an act of destruction. It looked solemn and beautiful, like a ritual. Her back remained perfectly straight, and her face did not droop. This was not the posture of a defeated person obeying a humiliating command. It was the fierce dignity of a person protecting her honor by her own will. The cold air of the airport touched her skin. The belt lost its weight and slipped from her hands. But it didn't fall to the floor. She supported it until the last moment, folded it neatly, and quietly placed it at her feet. The beauty of these movements made some women around her gasp involuntarily. Why could she move so beautifully in such a situation? This was not just resistance, it was a state of being. Her silence shook the hearts of all those present more deeply and powerfully than any loud protest. The belt was gone. Now the last and greatest humiliation awaited Eve, removing the vintage suit itself. She did not hesitate. With her thin fingertips, she quietly caught the collar of the suit and slowly opened it. The blue lilac silk fabric slipped from her shoulders. It was like petals quietly falling in the spring twilight. Again, a faint rustle of fabric was heard. It was pure, as if momentarily washing away the ugly tension in the place. Beneath the suit was only her simple white undergarment, a slip and bra. Its simplicity spoke volumes about her resolve. The suit did not fall to the floor. She held its ends firmly, neatly folding it over the belt, as if it were a part of herself. Duke was speechless, looking at this. Only one question formed in his head: why doesn't she resist? Why doesn't she scream? Her calm irritated him, but also vaguely shook something deep inside him. Take that off too. Duke roared to hide his own agitation. His voice trembled slightly. He couldn't back down. If he didn't find anything here, his actions would just be pointless violence. That fear made him even more cruel. Eve quietly obeyed this order too. She carefully reached for the straps of her slip. One by one, the clothes that protected her were removed. With each layer, the cold airport air touched her skin directly. This temperature change clearly reminded her of the reality she was in. But her heart was strangely calm. She no longer felt sadness or anger. There was only a quiet lake of emotions that accepted everything as it was. It felt as if she were watching herself from afar, like a stranger. Perhaps this is true American restraint, to calmly accept the disrespect and misunderstanding of others. By doing so, your dignity ascends to a place where no one can hurt it. In the midst of this humiliation, she was delving into deeper levels of her life philosophy. She could hear the quiet sound of her own breathing. Inhale, exhale. This simple repetition sustained her. Finally, only a simple white underwear set, panties and a bra, remained on her body. There were no weapons or hidden items. There was only a clean body toned by years of discipline. Silence dominated the hall. Duke and the other guards couldn't move. The evil they tried to expose did not exist. There was only one defenseless woman whose dignity they had trampled on due to their ignorance and prejudice. When they realized this, a cold feeling of regret began to grow in their hearts for the first time. Time stood still. Eve, in her underwear, surrounded by guards, and the thousands of people holding their breath, watching this absurd scene. No one knew what to do next. Duke felt his throat dry up. Nothing came out of the woman. His justice lost its foundation and was exposed as simply ugly violence under the bright light. What should I do? How do I resolve this situation? His head was filled with panic and confusion. The tense silence was cut by a scream. Stop this immediately. A high, sharp voice echoed sharply throughout the airport lobby, like thunder. People flinched and turned toward the source of the sound. The crowd parted like a wave, opening a path. Into that cry rushed two figures running frantically through the crowd. One was a middle-aged man in an expensive, perfectly tailored suit. The other was a young woman who looked like a translator. Her eyes were filled with panic. The loud, hurried sound of their leather shoes hitting the floor rapidly approached. They finally broke through the wave of people and ran to the center of the unreal scene. And when they saw her, they froze. There, calm and almost naked in her underwear, stood Evelyn Eve Mercer. Her beautifully folded vintage suit lay forlornly on the floor, like a tragic monument. Around her, the guards stood half encircling, closing in. Both new figures froze, as if time had stopped. The woman translator lost her speech, her mouth slightly open. The blood completely drained from her face, and her wide-open eyes were filled with despair and disbelief. "Oh my God. What have you done?" whispered the man in the suit, Senator Dave Ellis, a representative of the National Endowment for the Arts. His face was pale at first, but the next moment it flushed red with rage. This change was obvious to everyone. His clenched fist trembled. The atmosphere instantly changed. It was no longer cold tension. A burning heat of anger began to dominate the space. Senator Ellis slowly took a step forward. His gaze was fixed directly on Duke, the main culprit. The look was sharp as a spear. Duke instinctively backed away. He instantly realized that this man was not just some civilian. His expensive clothing and, most importantly, the aura of authority emanating from him, gave him away. "Do you realize what you have done and who is standing before you?" Ellis's voice was quiet, but beneath that calm, you could feel the lava of fierce anger boiling, ready to erupt. That one sentence planted the first and decisive seed of fear in Duke's heart. Ellis's words cut heavily and sharply into the silence of the lobby. He pointed a trembling finger at Duke, who stood bewildered. "Do you even remotely understand what you have committed?" His voice had passed anger and now carried a tone closer to sorrow. He slowly turned back to Eve and bowed deeply, deeply. His extraordinary respect made the guards physically feel that something had gone terribly wrong. "My deepest apologies, Ms. Mercer. I failed to ensure your security adequately, too." Ellis couldn't continue. Tears of desperation welled up in his eyes. He turned back to Duke and began to explain, forcing the words out. Every word of his fast speech was like a bullet hitting the hearts of the guards. "She is not just a tourist. This is an extremely important person officially invited by our United States government to deepen cultural ties with Asia." The air around them stirred with amazement. Officially invited? By the government? Duke could not immediately grasp the meaning of those words. "She is Evelyn Mercer, the head of the Catherine Mayfield Historical Costume Foundation. She is considered a living national treasure in cultural circles. She is a great artist." Living national treasure. That word finally rang out. Everyone in the hall knew the weight of that term. It was a person who symbolized the culture of the nation, one who should be treated with the highest respect. National treasure. Impossible, the word echoed in Duke's head. This quiet woman, whom he had just humiliated in public as a suspect, impossible. His thoughts completely stopped. The bewildered expressions of the guards were the best proof. They looked at each other. Their faces were white, contorted with fear. The justice they believed in was collapsing with a crash. They genuinely heard that sound in their hearts. The mood of the crowd changed drastically. The sneering curiosity disappeared, and now awe and a quiet anger toward the guards dominated the scene. How dare they treat a cultural ambassador like that? The whispered words painfully reached Duke's ears. At that moment, the woman translator, who had been crying until then, finally lifted her head. Through tears, but in a clear voice, she repeated Ellis's words, first in English and then loudly in Spanish, for the broad O'Hare crowd. Her voice definitively proved to everyone present that this tragic truth was an undeniable fact. No one could say anything more. The huge airport lobby was once again enveloped in absolute silence. But it was not the tense silence from before. It was a heavy, oppressive silence facing an irreparable mistake. Living national treasure. That word was no longer just information. It settled heavily in the hearts of everyone present, like a weighty iron block. Especially for Duke. It sounded like a death sentence. His head went blank. Time stretched out slowly, as if frozen. Where had his self-confidence gone? He couldn't accept the reality of what was happening. She's a treasure? The quiet woman I forced to undress in front of everyone. All his previous actions flashed clearly in his mind. His insulting words, the feeling of her roughly squeezed arm, and that cold order to strip her of her dignity before thousands of eyes. It was all a huge mistake. It was not just a professional error. He had trampled on the pride of a person and the very culture of an entire nation. The airport lobby was unnaturally silent. The noise he heard before seemed like an event from a distant world. Only his own heart beating loudly, thump-thump, pounded noisily in Duke's ears. That heartbeat was the drum of fear. He felt a cold sweat stream down his back. That coldness seemed to freeze his body from the inside. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His limbs were going numb. The woman he had humiliated as a suspect was a vital person his country should have welcomed as a guest of honor. That absolute fact completely paralyzed his thinking. He fearfully looked at Eve. She stood perfectly composed, quietly. She wasn't looking at Duke. She wasn't looking at anyone, just staring straight ahead. There was no anger, no sadness, and not even the joy of victory on her face. Before her immense calm, Duke realized how small and foolish he was. Time remained frozen. No one could move in that icy space. Ellis's anger, the translator's grief, the crowd's surprise, all of it seemed concentrated and solidified in that one point. It was the moment when the irreparable mistake revealed its full magnitude. And Duke, at the center of that mistake, could only silently sink to the bottom of a deep sea of despair, crushed by the weight. The frozen time was broken by numerous, hurried footsteps coming from afar. They sounded like the approach of a small army. The crowd parted again. Running through the gap were several men and women in airport uniforms, their faces deathly pale. In the center was a white-haired man who looked like a typical executive. This was the chief director of O'Hare International Airport. With one glance, he grasped the situation. The suit on the floor, Eve in her underwear, the enraged Senator Ellis. He instantly realized this was a fatal blunder that could escalate into an international incident. My deepest apologies, his voice trembled.